One thing I love about Final Fantasy is that each game in the main series is unique. They all have original storylines, with new characters, unexplored game worlds, interesting mythologies, and reworked battle mechanics and questing systems. With each new Final Fantasy game that's released, it seems Square always attempts to evolve their formula, both by combining what has been successful in previous games, as well as working in entirely new ideas. Final Fantasy III is a perfect example of that process, as Square combined elements of the first two games brilliantly, while also finding time to implement a new system that the series would later become famous for. Final Fantasy III was released on April 27, 1990, and marked the end of a gaming generation, being the last game that Square would develop for the Famicom. Similar to the previous installment, Final Fantasy III did not see a North American release on the NES. It would not make its way outside of Japan until the game was remade for the Nintendo DS in 2006. Unlike with the second game, Square took a great deal more time developing Final Fantasy III, and the effort really shows. Gone are the bugged spells and attribute multipliers, and what we're left with is a pretty well balanced game aside from a few minor issues. My absolute favorite addition to Final Fantasy III is the auto-target system, which redirects your character's physical attacks to the next enemy if the one they were previously selected to attack dies or retreats from battle prematurely. It only works for physical attacks, unfortunately, but it is still greatly appreciated. I cannot express how frustrating it was in the first two games to issue ineffective commands constantly. They even included indicators to show which of your party members have been selected to attack specific enemies, which is a great way to keep track of what you're doing during longer battles with lots of enemies. One of the most impressive aspects of Final Fantasy III is its massive scope. The sheer size of this game simply dwarfs the first two installments in almost every facet, and showcases incredible organization by the designers. The fact that they were able to cram a game this complex into a Famicom cartridge is extremely impressive, but then again, one might expect as much from a third installment of a franchise on a single platform. One example of this increase in scope is demonstrated by the game's musical score. Nobuo Uematsu wrote 44 original pieces for Final Fantasy III, twice as many as were included in the first two games. It's obvious that by this time, Uematsu had developed a keen understanding for what his limitations were, as well as what combinations of sounds worked best for a Famicom game. Unlike Final Fantasy II, which was comprised of many slow, simple themes, Final Fantasy III's music contains much more complexity, with a masterful use of dynamics. Uematsu outdid himself with this soundtrack, and composed what is easily the best of the Famicom Final Fantasy musical scores. As far as game mechanics go, Final Fantasy III is sort of a hybrid of its predecessors with an enormous new addition. The character progression system from the first game makes a return with a slight influence from Final Fantasy II, compounded in complexity by the introduction of class changing. While this wasn't the first game to include a class changing system, Dragon Warrior 3 retains that honor, it was much more complex, allowing any character to change class at any time the player wished. There are 22 classes altogether, providing a lot of room for the player to experiment and find which combinations of classes fit his or her playing style most efficiently. Like the original game, each character levels up as you gain experience points in battle, but at certain key points in the game there are new classes that become available, and these classes can also be leveled up for each character similarly to how attributes were leveled up in Final Fantasy II. The player can switch between classes freely by spending class points, which are also earned in battle. One of the coolest things about the class changing system is that each class contains its own unique command ability, giving unique commands like steal, jump, and summon to their respective classes for the first time in the series. It also allowed for some pretty interesting perks on the game world. For example, if a thief is at the head of your party, doors could be unlocked without keys. However, it must be said that there are definitely balance issues between the various classes, and a few of them are downright useless when compared to the more powerful options that are available. These glaring balance issues are probably the only complaint I have with the game, but it's a pretty big complaint. One thing I was really disappointed to see, but was later able to forgive, was the return of magic charges for mages. In the first game, this system made using magic anywhere outside of boss battles extremely wasteful, because there were very few charges available to use. While Final Fantasy III does use the same system for casting magic, at least the developers had the courtesy to provide enough charges to bring greater balance between the melee and magic wielding classes. It was nice not to have to deal with running out of magic charges in the middle of a dungeon this time around. Other new additions to Final Fantasy III include several new vehicle types that can be acquired throughout the game, including the Enterprise, which could sail on the open seas and soar through the skies, the Nautilus, which could both fly and dive underwater, and my personal favorite, the Invincible, a mammoth airship that could fly over mountains and be navigated on the inside, including its own shops and quarters for characters to rest and recover strength. Final Fantasy III also introduced players to two classic and later reoccurring Final Fantasy icons. Moogles, which are small winged bear-like creatures that have operated throughout the series as shopkeepers, housekeepers, and battlemates, and Fat Chocobo, who acts as a bottomless box to store all of the items the player cannot carry in a limited inventory. And now we move on to the game's narrative, which isn't bad by any means, but is one of the game's weaker aspects. There's really just not much to it. There's no characterization in the original version at all, and it doesn't bring any deep or profound philosophies to the table. It also rides a lot on classic RPG cliches, but it's pretty obvious that the storyline really wasn't the primary focus for the developers this time around, like it was for Final Fantasy II. Rather, most of their efforts were focused on the game's mechanics, which were mostly excellent. I also give this game somewhat of a pass because it was released on the Famicom. Famicom games had space limitations that made it almost impossible to write deep scripts with moving storylines and dialogue. For that reason alone, I'll say that the story is actually pretty decent considering the limitations of the platform. The story follows four orphan boys who stumble upon the Wind Crystal buried deep within a hidden cave. The crystal informs them that they have been chosen to bring balance to the world, and grants them a portion of its power. Although the boys don't understand what the crystal means by bringing balance to the world, they set off on a quest to understand its judgments. A group of blind prophets called the Gurgans inform them of a catastrophic event that occurred thousands of years prior, where a flood of light threatened to destroy the world and return it to the void, pronouncing that the opposite is about to come to pass. This is all due to a vengeful warlock named Zand, a pupil of the Archmage Noah, who intends to possess all four crystals of light and plunge the earth into darkness and chaos. Arriving at the Crystal Tower in the Dark World, the four warriors discover that the Cloud of Darkness is actually the mastermind behind the evil plot, and with the help of the four Dark Warriors who saved the world from the Flood of Light centuries earlier, they defeat the Cloud of Darkness and bring balance to the world once and for all. While this may not sound like much of a plot by today's standards, it was actually pretty impressive for a Famicom game, and provides just the right amount of motivation to keep the player fighting through a number of impressively designed dungeons. The developers played it safe in a lot of ways, retreading a number of tropes already established by the first game, but there are still a number of memorable moments that make this game stand out in its own right. Final Fantasy III is a huge game, definitely the most substantial RPG Square had made up to that point. It brought together the most successful elements of the first two games and combined them in a way that was both intelligent and fun. Most of the bugs that plagued the first two games were fixed, the new additions added to the framework are balanced fairly well, and it seems that Square finally gave themselves enough time to nail the formula for the last Final Fantasy game to be released during the Famicom NES era. My only complaint with the game is that while there's greater balance achieved between the basic melee and magic wielding classes, there isn't a very good balance between the other various classes available, which made it discouraging to experiment beyond the few classes that were clearly the most powerful in the game. Overall, I give Final Fantasy III 4 incredibly overpowered ninjas out of 5.